Last video I shared, I believe the Watchers are bound beneath the beautiful National Park of Yellowstone. Yes, Yellowstone, where buffalo roam and geysers are faithful. And if you haven't seen that video yet, I highly recommend you watching it first. Now let's get to the rest. Are the Watchers still bound there, or were they released? There's differing opinions on the matter because the answer is not entirely straightforward. In some ways, Enoch seems to be conflicting himself. Enoch 10 verses 12 through 14. When all their sons kill each other, when they see the destruction of their beloved ones, bind them for 70 generations under the hills of the earth, until the day of their judgment, and of their consummation, until the judgment, which is for all eternity, is accomplished. And in those days it will lead them to the abyss of fire and torment, and in prison they will be shut up for all eternity. And then Semyaza will be burnt, from then on destroyed with them. Together they will be bound until the end of all generations. It begins by saying bind them for 70 generations. Then it says forever, and ends by saying all generations. Well, which is it? Is it 70 generations or all generations? Well, I think the answer to both those questions is yes. There's a 70 generation judgment which comes to an end sometime before the 1,000-year reign. Then there's the forever judgment when they're imprisoned once again, probably alongside the beast and false prophet in Revelation 19. And from this final judgment, there is no release. Though it's possible the answer might be a little more nuanced than that. Since angels are spiritual beings, maybe their spirits are released after 70 generations, while their physical bodies are still bound in everlasting shackles, like Jude says. That would keep them from having any more, big kids. That's what I personally believe, and it could be why Enoch seems to be saying two things at once, because they were released and they're still bound. As weird as that sounds. I'll delve deeper into this theory in a future video. Either way, spiritual or physical, Enoch 67 seems to confirm that there is some kind of release. And those same waters will undergo a change in those days, for when those angels are punished in these water springs shall change their temperature. And when the angels ascend, this water of the springs shall change and become cold. So when they ascended, the waters became cold. That sounds like a release, does it not, to ascend from where they were? Now we have to figure out when or did the 70 generations come to an end. I put together a timeline chart of the Patriarchs on my website, and in it I have the date of the flood as 1308. I got this by combining the dates found in the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Book of Jubilees. If you want more details, I have an article just for the timeline along with a free download of the chart. Check out the link in the description. So going on the basis that the flood was in the year 1308, I think it's safe to say that's probably when the Watchers were bound. But would 70 generations from 1308 work? I personally believe a generation is 70 years. As I've been researching the timeline, 70 years is what seems to make the most sense. And it's also the amount of time that Moses says a man lives. Psalm 90:10. The days of our lives are 70 years, or if due to strength, 80 years. Yet the best of them is but toil and exertion, for it is soon cut off and we fly away. So if you're strong, 80 years, but typically 70 years. And remember, Moses lived to 120, so when he says 70 years, he's probably speaking of a broader truth. Because of that, I'm going with 70. So 70 generations would be 70 times 70, which is 4,900 years. Though I don't think the Watcher's sentence was 70 generations. Otherwise, they'd be released in the year 6208, which would be in the middle of the 1,000-year reign. I say that because in Enoch 92, he gives a 10-week prophecy, or 7,000 years, which spans from the Genesis creation all the way to the final judgment. So between the years 6 to 7,000, or the majority of those years, would be the 1,000-year reign, before Satan's little season and the final judgment. And maybe I'm wrong, but I can't imagine the Watchers being released during such an amazing time. Before the reign, sure. After the reign, maybe. But during it, I don't think so. Though it may be possible that the 70 generations is referring to the biblical year and not the sentence, meaning sometime after the year 4900 they were released, which would be about 3,600 years from the flood. That could work. Because of that, I think they were released in either the year 4901, after 70 generations were complete, or the year 4908. I say that because the number 8 is often associated with something new in the biblical timeline. Not always something good, but a change. The flood, for example, was in 1308, and according to Jubilees, the fall of man occurred 1300 years earlier in year 8. So maybe the generational timeline of man begins from the fall and not from creation. That would mean the Watchers were released in 4908, 3600 years exactly from the flood. That would be my guess, because if you've noticed, the Father likes to move in whole numbers. 40 years in the wilderness, 70 years Jerusalem is desolate, Daniel's 70-week prophecy. There's definitely a correlation between the important moments in Scripture and units of 10. So if I had to pick between the Watchers being bound for 3,593 years to 4901, or 3,600 years to 4908, the latter seems more fitting with the other times in Scripture. Now this date means very little if we don't know when 4908 was on our modern calendar. But don't worry, I wasn't going to leave you hanging. It's my belief that biblical year 4908 was year 1063 AD, and it began at the fall equinox in September. That would mean about 960 years ago, the Watchers were released from their prison. You just rolled your eyes, didn't you? That's fair. 1063 is a pretty specific date, and you want to know if I can prove it? I can try, but I don't want to spend too much time on the timeline, so I'm going to move fast. You ready? Give me 90 seconds starting now. Jubilees also tells us when the Exodus occurred. It was 1103 years after the flood, year 2411. And from here, we can find out when the first temple began construction. We're told in 1 Kings it was the 480th year after the Exodus, year 2891. When tracking through the years of the kingdoms of Judah and Israel, I believe the end began 410 years later, when Nebuchadnezzar first pillaged Jerusalem, in year 3301. But he didn't completely demolish Jerusalem for another 18 years, year 3319. From here we begin the 70 years that Jerusalem was desolate, followed by Daniel's 70 weeks to Mashiach. That began in year 3389. The final week of Daniel's prophecy began in 3872, a Jubilee year. I believe this is when John the Baptist began preparing the way for Mashiach. Then halfway through that final week, our Mashiach, Yehoshua, put an end to sin and was crucified in the year 3875. Most people believe he was crucified in either 30 or 33 AD, but when combining the time frame of the Sabbaths surrounding the crucifixion with the luminary pattern of the Enoch calendar, I believe he was actually crucified in 31 AD. Which means 31 AD was biblical year 3875. And from here we add up till we get to 4908. And since years begin in the fall, that would mean biblical year 4908 began in September of 1063 AD. Whew! You still with me? That was a lot of information. Any one of those topics could have their own video. And in time they may, but for now I just want you to see that I'm not pulling these dates out of thin air. I've done a lot of research and I pray it's right. And as of now, where I stand, I believe the Watchers were released in or around 1063 AD. So did anything noteworthy occur around that time? Well, remember what Enoch said would happen when the angels ascended? That the waters would change and become cold. Now, I'm not entirely sure this is what he meant, but it's worth noting that Old Faithful, that famous geyser that erupts every 90 minutes, well, it hasn't always been so faithful, as this article states. Scientists believe that from the mid-13th to the mid-14th century, it stopped erupting. Is there a connection? Was there a change in the Yellowstone waters that affected the geothermal activity? To be fair, this will be about 200 years after my 1063 estimate, so it's not exact. However, according to that same article in USGS, the study which determined when Old Faithful took a break was based off another study from a man named George Marler, who carbon dated trees near the Old Faithful geyser mound, and this dating process had an uncertainty period of 200 years. Well, isn't that interesting? 200 years of uncertainty could put it right at 1063. Huh. That would be nice if there was evidence that was a little more explosive, you know? Some event that was more monumental. What if a volcano erupted? Have you ever heard of Sunset Crater Volcano? It's just north of Flagstaff, Arizona, and not too far from the Grand Canyon. It erupted once, made a fuss, then went back to sleep. I was able to visit it not too long ago and check out the lava flow field, which seems to go on and on. It was impressive. These lava rocks may or may not be from said field, and they may or may not be connected to the Watcher's release. The official story as of today is that the volcano erupted in 1085 AD. But that wasn't always the story. Originally, they believed it erupted 20 years earlier, in 1064 to 1065, just 1 to 2 years after my 1063 estimate. Now that's close. And the Smithsonian website says the eruption was in 1075, plus or minus 25 years, which is still within the window. When I was at the visitor center, I asked one of the staff members, why did they change from 1064 to 1085? She said the original estimate was based off of tree ring data that they got at the volcano, but later on they increased the sample size and went to other parts of Arizona, and they felt that 1085 was a more accurate estimate. And maybe they're right. Maybe the new evidence is more accurate than the old evidence. Maybe. But didn't our Mashiach say that the old wine tastes better than the new? And isn't it true that volcanic soil is good for making grapes and wine? Okay, so that has nothing to do with what we're talking about. But seriously, whether we're looking at the estimate from the Smithsonian of 1075, the original estimate of 1064 to 1065, or the newer one of 1085, that's close enough to raise an eyebrow, is it not? I mean, if a volcano erupted the moment the watchers were released, that's pretty wild. And check this out. This is a brochure I got from the Sunset Crater Visitor Center. It has a painting from Hopi artist Michael Caboti depicting what looks like winged creatures ascending from an erupting volcano. Now, I'm sure that doesn't mean anything. Now, you may be saying, wait a minute, why would a volcano erupt in Arizona if the watchers were bound in Wyoming? Well, that's where things get fascinating. Last video I pointed out a 3,300 meter stretch in the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone where I believe the watchers were bound, and I told you I'd explain why I felt that was the exact location later. Well, here we are, my friends. Buckle up. Did you know there's a close connection between biblical measurements and a metric system? A biblical cubit, called an amma, is said to be half a meter. And if there's a connection between cubits and meters, maybe there is with larger units as well, like kilometers. I bring this up because that location, that crevice in Yellowstone, just so happens to be 1,044 kilometers away from Sunset Crater Volcano. 144. It also happens to be 144 degrees west of Mount Sinai, or very close. Because if Mount Sinai is where most people believe at Mount Catherine, that would place it about 144.5 degrees west. However, some people believe that Mount Sinai is further west at Mount Serbal, close to the Gulf of Suez. If that's the case, that spot in Yellowstone is 144 degrees and 6 minutes west, or 144.1 degrees. That's 144 forward and backwards. And the fours don't stop there. The coordinates for that location in the canyon is about 44.72 degrees north, or 44 degrees and 43 to 44 minutes. Also, if we're looking at the Yellowstone caldera as a whole, the National Park Service says it's 72 by 48 kilometers. Isn't it interesting that both those numbers are multiples of 144? Are you seeing a pattern? So in summary, that section of the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone is 1,044 kilometers from a volcano that may have erupted the moment the watchers were released. It's also 144 degrees west from where the Torah was given to Moses, a Torah that was probably necessary in part because of the wickedness the watchers introduced to mankind. And its location is 44 degrees, 44 minutes north, inside a caldera with a length and width that are multiples of 144. That all has to mean something. 1,044. Do you remember in part 1 when I said, I just wanted an excuse to read that scripture? It was a psalm about his angels being a flame of fire. Well, that just so happened to be chapter 104, verse 4. 1044. That's peculiar. Now let's look at the number 144. The most obvious connection is the 144,000 of Revelation. And that may be important because in the book of Numbers, the ones who were numbered were men of fighting age, from the age of 20 until they could no longer fight. Since the Father's ways do not change, is it possible then that the 144,000 is an army put together by Yah to combat the forces of evil, or specifically the works of the Watchers? Is that a sign of the 144? And by the way, the first numbering of the people occurred in the wilderness of Sinai. There is something about Sinai. Here's a not so obvious 144 connection. Genesis 1 describes the creation of 22 different things, from the heavens and the earth to man and woman. The 14th mention is the creation of the stars on day 4, 144. And the stars, as you probably know, are often associated with the angels. How about that? Now let's look at the number 44. We're told in both the books of Jubilees and Enoch that in the days of Jared, the Watchers descended. Well, here's where it gets cool. According to the Masoretic text in the Samaritan Pentateuch, Jared was born in the year 460. Now, on the Enoch calendar, that would have been the 4th year of the lunisolar cycle. That's because the sun, moon, and stars move in 19-year cycles, and year 460 would have been the 4th year of that cycle. On top of that, it just so happens that the 44th month of the cycle occurs in the 4th year. So, could that have been the month the Watchers descended? 444. Makes you wonder. All I know for sure is this. When it comes to scripture, I don't believe in coincidence. So when I see repeating numbers pop up like 1044, 144, or 44, it makes me think I might be looking in the right direction. That the Watchers were imprisoned in Yellowstone, that they were released in or around the biblical year 4908, which I believe is 1063 AD. And for those of us who are trying to figure it out, we were given signs that we can unearth that mystery. Well, that's my theory. I hope you enjoyed it, because you're never going to look at Yellowstone the same way again. Or New York City. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, stay in that thin gate.